Hello and welcome to CG Visuals. My name's Zach, and today we'll be having a look at the fire category within Trapcode Elements. So we'll begin by opening After Effects and navigating to the Trapcode Elements folder, and in the Fire category we're going to choose this Fireblast Manipulation project. I've found that this is the go-to fire project. It's one of the more versatile presets, and it works for a whole bunch of things. So we'll start having a little look at what this effect is doing. I'm going to keep the caching times as they are so that we can get a realistic idea of what the project is like to work with. Keep in mind this is a fluid simulation, and as we jump forward in increments here, After Effects will be loading that into the RAM. That's why it's always good to have at least 32 gigs of RAM when you're working with fluid simulations in After Effects. So we'll go to the particles comp here. This is where we'll make all our changes to the sim. And I'm going to bring in this background image to work with. I'm going to place it in the particles comp as a reference. And you'll notice we've got this emission locator and these particle controls. I'm going to remove all the keyframes just so we can start from scratch. Now, to help us set up the animation, I'm going to create this red solid and just make a circle. I'll make that a 3D layer, and by pressing P on the layers here we can pick whip the position to the emission locator, and now when we move the locator we can actually get a visual representation of where our null object is actually going to go. So I'll switch to the orthographic view here. We can see this is where our camera is in relation to our scene. And I want to create some interesting organic looking animations. So using as few keyframes as possible, I'm just going to go forward by about half a second and plan out a general route for this emitter. If we right click, go to keyframe interpolation and choose continuous there, we can get more of a can allow After Effects to help us work out what those curves are going to be, to make sure we don't get any unusual stopping animations. So this will be a nice continuous motion. So we'll quickly preview this. In my mind I'm going for some sort of sweeping motion. Perhaps someone is doing some kind of kick, and so this fire is going to follow the path of that movement. So we do want it to be quite an aggressive and fast movement if we want this to be interesting. So we can make a few more tweaks here. We're not bringing the sim into this just yet because we want to really refine this animation. And now I want there to be like a second sweeping motion, but going the opposite direction. So I'm going to create a similar path here. So I'll create some more keyframes. As you can see, these new keyframes don't have the curve paths there. So I'll go to keyframe interpolation, go to continuous Bezier, and that will give us our handles. And then we'll continue to make a few more tweaks here, try to get the movement to look organic. And if we go can't see much in that view, so back in the active camera view here, we'll preview this again. I think we'll add some verticality to these movements. I might try having this second sweeping animation going a bit higher, and we'll see what that looks like. It's all about experimentation at this phase. Okay, so that could be interesting. Let's give that a preview. And I think on second thoughts, we'll actually change this motion path here. This is the stage where we want to make lots of tweaks and make sure we're happy with the animation, because when we bring fluids into it, it will start to slow down. So this responsiveness is what allows us to get these nice movements. It would be a lot easier if we had an actor performing some motions as well. But we're just going to have to use our imagination here. So once we're happy with this, I think we'll move on to the next stage, which is previewing the actual simulation. So we're going to need some keyframes here. Emission again. Starting off at 0. Starting with the buoyancy at 1 and then increasing that to 5. And you can see here, as this red ball moves around, we're deciding when the particles are going to activate and when they're going to be turned off. So we'll just put those keyframes there. It's quite simple when you get used to it. We'll hide our emitter reference, and now we'll start to see what this looks like. So we'll start by enabling the fire and smoke here. There are actually 3 simulations, so we'll just preview one of them. Going to turn off some of these more taxing effects, and the subframe sampling motion blur is definitely a taxing effect. So at half res with the motion blur disabled, we'll give this a quick preview and see how it's looking straight off the bat. So we can see our particles are beginning to be generated. And this is the initial motion we have, so it's looking okay. There are a few small issues here. As our fluid sim moves so quickly, it's actually jumping ahead a little bit, and a few of these particles are being spawned unnaturally. So the faster we move our emitter, we might want to reduce the velocity from motion, as that is trying to push the particles out in front of the object with the speed. And even though we've increased the frame rate of the composition to 50 to allow for more subframes to interpolate the animation, it can still be subject to a few glitches. So reducing that velocity from motion again will help. That's definitely solved the issue. And if we don't want to preview every single frame, 50 frames a second is a little bit time consuming. We can just jump forward in little increments just to give enough time for the fluid to load into the RAM and then be cached and previewed as a frame. And as long as we don't jump too far ahead, we can actually keep the interactivity quite high. And it's not real time, but it is fast enough that we can work without getting frustrated. So now let's, I think because the fire goes so close to the floor, we actually want it to be occluded by the floor. So if I go into the visibility and select the obscuration layer as the grid here, we can then just bring this grid up to where the floor would be, and it will start occluding the fire where it comes into contact with the floor. And this will just add a little bit of extra interactivity. That's a bit too high. And of course, if we had a fireball impacting the floor, we could have a second fire simulation shooting off in different directions to mimic the effect of fire spreading out to create some more interactivity. But in this case, we'll just have it occluded by the floor there. Should work fine. We'll move forward a bit further just to see what it's doing. Okay, so now we'll start adding in some of the other effects as well. These billowing flames, the embers, all using fluids as well. So we've got multiple iterations of our fluid sim here. When you're working with files like this, it's a good idea to have a large cache file allocated to After Effects. In the Preferences menu, we can choose how much space After Effects will use to store information on how to render this. And I'm not sure if that is what's happening here, but I'm not sure if it's my imagination, but it feels like it's starting to preview even faster despite the fact that we have all of these extra simulations. I haven't sped this up at all. This is the real speed of which I'm able to jump through all these frames here. So it might be the case that the more we work with the sim, the faster it becomes to preview. And I'm just going to add the visibility occlusion layer to the embers and the billowing flames as well, just to make sure we don't have any embers floating through the floor there, although it probably wouldn't matter in this case. I want to see what our second fire sweep looks like. So that one's coming across quite nicely as well. Okay, I think that's all working reasonably well. We'll just preview a few of these frames, and then I think once we're happy to move forward to compositing, we'll re-enable the motion blur, and we've got subframe sampling of 16 in some of these effects. We've got refined soft matte edges there, which is adding additional motion blur samples to the edges. So when we add all of this motion blur in, that's when our render time is going to increase drastically. Most of the render time is actually the motion blur samples rather than the fluid sim. And of course when we go to full res here, this is going to be a lot longer. So I think while we're waiting for this, we'll just decide what our render region is going to be. Okay, now that that has finished previewing, just so we can have a look at it at full res, I think now it's time to render this as an asset. So we'll go to Add to Render Queue, we'll choose a QuickTime format, make sure it has an alpha channel, and then we're just going to go ahead and render this as an asset. I'll just call this Fire Sweeps 01. And then we'll render this out. This was quite a big animation, so it did actually rack up quite a bit of render time here of about 5 hours and 50 minutes. But we only had to render it once, and we were able to make all of our iterations very quickly in the particles comp. And then when we wanted the realism, that's when we were able to add all the extra motion blur here and get an end result that will look very realistic and satisfying when it's on screen, which at the end of the day is what it's all about. We're trying to make this look like fire. We don't want it to look like a simulation or a fluid sim. So now that we've pre-rendered that, we'll re-import the asset that we just rendered, and we'll bring this in here into the particles comp, solo that as a layer, so that now we have the speed of our pre-rendered asset here. And now we can go into the compositing export comp here, which is adding its own additional host of effects like heat distortion, various different glow effects, and it all adds up. So if we bring our background in here, we're getting a pretty decent result straight away. You can see here that the scene is actually changing its exposure to accommodate the fire. If we have a look at these compositing options here, we have all of the options for how much glow we want the fire to have. We can change this glow radius here. I think the default setting worked okay. So we'll leave that on 400. We've got the fire contrast here. Maybe if this was an outdoor shot and we wanted the fire to be a lot more darker and less exposed, we could play around with the contrast here. This smoke contrast will control how thick the smoke is versus how much of the fire. So if we bring this down, we can get more luminosity. It might be more appropriate for the effect we're trying to create. We've got some basic gamma controls here. We can boost the exposure, although I don't think that will really be necessary. We can also play with the sharpness to get different levels of softness, or if we put that to 100 there, we'll get quite a dramatic result. I think we'll go for a modest 50 with the sharpness. This is quite a fun setting. We've got the hue slider here, so we can go through some different colours. So we've got the green, and if we go to 180, we've got one of my favourite colours, which is blue. Got the heat distortion options. We can also change this compound blur, which has some interesting effects. Can make the fire look a bit more hazy, which would sell more if you had a lot more smoke in the foreground. This exposure here will control how dark the background plate becomes. We've also got this ground lighting here, just some placeholder scene lighting. Also got the fire can have shadows if it has quite a lot of smoke, so we might as well adjust this shadow here and bring the shadow floor layer down. Of course we'll reduce the shadow opacity so it's barely visible, but there are some scenarios where shadow would be quite visible. I also want to add a reflection to the fire as well, since we're trying to make this look as nice as possible. So I'll duplicate this export pre-comp here, rename it to reflection, and then we'll toggle the scale and we'll just flip this vertically. And we're obviously going to drag this down so it looks like a reflection. I'll bring that below the effect here. Quite a shiny floor, so we'll bring this down. And to make it look more like a reflection, I'm going to add a compound blur. We'll increase the maximum blur to about 60. And then in the blur layer, we'll actually select the background image so that the blur conforms to some of the contrast points on the floor there. It's looking a bit too obvious, so we'll use a curves adjustment here. You can darken it down a bit, but maybe bring down the RGB and also the alpha here. And then I think we'll also just bring down the opacity of the layer as well to about 50%. Yeah, we'll bring that down to 50. We'll go to full res really quickly and just have a look at this. The only issue I'm thinking is that the reflection is actually going over the carpet there. So I'm just going to create a subtraction mask for the carpet. Give it a little bit of feathering, just so that our reflection only goes where it's supposed to go. And once we're happy with all of that, we'll re-enable everything, hide all the layers to keep the workflow nice and easy to understand. As the fire moves around there, you can see it forcing the camera to readjust its exposure, all the heat distortion and embers. There's quite a lot of different stuff going on. It's not just fire with a screen transfer mode and a glow effect. There's a lot of stuff going on here to make it look realistic. So we'll pre-render this out and see what this looks like. We've also got a blue fire version here as well, which was quite fun. Okay, so that was fun, but believe it or not, we're going to create something even more ambitious. So if we start with a new project and we'll open up, this time we'll go into the flamethrowers category and we'll choose this napalm flamethrower, which is one of the largest flamethrower effects. Let's have a quick run through of this in half res to get an idea of what this project is doing. We're going to do something quite exciting this time. We're going to have 2 of these flamethrowers, both different colours, red and blue, impacting each other, and we'll have a look at creating some interactivity for the fire. So we can see what the caching speeds are like. Again, we're working with a large fluid simulation, although it is very well optimized, so it doesn't take anywhere near as long as you would expect. So let's go to the particles comp here. And we'll unhide these layers, just so we can see the other hidden layers here, like this proxy simulation. So that's always good to know. Personally, I just like to disable the motion blur for the main sim and work with that, even though it's a bit slower. But what we want to do here is actually create some kind of zone where the fire is actually impacted. So I'm creating a null object here, and we've named that force field. And what we want to do is make it seem like the fire is being impacted by an opposing force. So we'll make sure this object here is aligned with the fire. And then we'll unhide the layers again. We'll make our fire particles layer visible. And we'll go into the motion blur here, disable that. And then we'll go into the physics tab and we'll temporarily change the physics from fluid to air, because we want to have access to some of the turbulent controls here. So before we do that, we'll create some sliders and add these to our force field object here. So I'm going to name that radius, strength, and feather. We'll make sure these are visible here, and then we'll start pick whipping some of these options. So we'll change the sim to air, say goodbye to the fluids. We'll go to this spherical field here and we'll pick whip the strength to the corresponding slider. We'll do the same with the radius. So fun fact about this sim is the main fuel itself uses fluids, and then all of the extra additional fire uses auxiliary particles that are using the air type. So we'll pick whip all of those values there, the sphere position to the force field. We'll go back to the fluids model here, and now we can actually start influencing the air particles even while we're in the fluid mode. So we'll try changing some of these settings. We can see the fire is starting to be affected. So we basically have a spherical field that is rebounding these particles here, so the particles will be forced to go around it. So if we play with some of these values here, the idea is to create a large wall that none of the particles can get through. So if we make the sphere large enough, we won't see the particles going around it, we'll just see them being stopped by the edge. So we'll create an even larger radius here. You can see the separation of the fluid engine there, which is not affected by the spherical field, unfortunately. Just our auxiliary particles are. So the fluids will continue, but the other particles will be stopped. And we can simply fix this by just having our fluid particles disappear sooner. So I think this is a good frame to work on. We'll just go to our opacity settings and we'll just remove a few of these, and we'll just make it so the fuel source will still be there, it'll just be invisible. So we'll bring these down a bit more. Nothing that a simple subtraction mask couldn't solve, but we'll try and do this just with the settings. Okay, so now we have a big jet of fire that looks like it's coming up against some kind of force, which is good, which is what we want. And now we'll go to the particle controls, and we want this to be, let me see, these are the number of particles starting at 0, going forward a few frames, jumps up to 3,500. The velocity gradually increases here, up to 10,000, then it remains at those values. So we'll start off with our default strength, and then at about 1.5 seconds, I want the fire to suddenly intensify. So I'll increase these particles to 7,000 and the velocity to maybe 20,000. And this will create a big visible increase in the intensity and speed, almost as if the flamethrower is increasing in power. Of course, more particles, it'll be a little bit slower when we get to this point, but not by much. I should be able to notice this stream becoming a bit more thicker now. More particles means more opportunity for them to disperse in an interesting way. So they're definitely creating the desired effect. So let's bring in the actual image that I have in mind, which is this digital matte painting of a palace plaza that I thought would be quite appropriate. So we'll drag that in, just using it as a reference so that we can line up our grid and camera. Might only be a subtle change here, but you know, technically the perspective will be correct. Especially if this fire was closer to the ground and we wanted it to be interacting with the floor. Having this grid in the right place will definitely work. This is the nice thing about having a live simulation in After Effects. We can make all these dozens of tiny little tweaks. At any moment we could just randomize the whole sim and change it completely if we wanted. And then what we'll do is we'll duplicate the particles comp here. So now we have two duplicate versions, and we'll go into the second one, and we want to create the same flamethrower but coming from the opposite side of the screen. So we'll wait for this to load here. Okay, so we've disabled our force field here, so the fire's going everywhere. I'm just going to move this emission locator to the other side, as we're obviously trying to create two flamethrowers impacting each other. We'll go to the aim left and right controls, and if we put this to 0, we'll see it shooting away, and then if we put it to -90, then it will go to the other side. The aim up and down as well is self-explanatory, but we'll leave those controls as they are. We'll move that across a little bit more. We'll adjust our force field here so it's on the other side. And we'll get to a frame where we can see where it should be affected, and we'll put our strength back up to 50. That's looking a bit over the top, so we'll bring that down. We'll just make the adjustments we need to here. Pretty soon I think we'll give this a preview soon, just so we can see if there's any issues. I want to see what they look like both together, so I'm actually going to drag the initial particles comp into this one, and now we can see both of the flamethrowers can see how they interact with each other. And it's previewing remarkably fast, considering there are now 2 simulations. I guess when you have the motion blur turned off though, it's quite manageable. So I think the strength is a bit too high. If we just turn down the strength to maybe 25. And I think if we've turned the strength down to 25 for one of them, we'll probably want to repeat that change for both of them. So we'll lock the layer. Yeah, we'll put the strength down to 25 for both of the particles here. So every time you make a change in particles comp 1, we just need to replicate that change in particles comp 2 as well. And let's give this a quick preview. So the only issue I'm seeing is because it's a complete duplicate of the sim, it almost looks like they've been mirrored, which and since they are unique simulations, we might as well go into the random seed and actually change the simulation entirely. We'll also change the particles as well. So we've got 2, we can randomize the particles, which can affect the fluids, and we can randomize the actual seed of the fluid engine itself as well. So we should be able to create something that looks different. So I'm just going to make a few more tweaks to the opacity here. And I think we'll keyframe the force field strength here. So I'm going to start at 25, and then I'm going forward about a second, and I'm just increasing that strength to 50. So now when the fire flamethrowers initially impact each other, there isn't much force, but then that force increases, and it's increased a little bit too much actually, if I'm honest. It started off okay, and now we're getting quite a chaotic result, so we definitely need to fix that. So might have gone a bit too much with the velocity of the fire here, so I'm just going to bring that down from 20,000 to 15,000. We'll also bring the particles down from 7,000 to 5,000 and just make sure those changes are consistent. Again, we did that in one comp, so we'll just do the same thing. So bring those particles down a bit and we'll see if that helps. So now that the velocity isn't quite as high, we'll also go into the auxiliary settings and we'll change the stop emitting at percentage of life. So initially it was set to 75, but we'll have those particles cease to spawn earlier on. And we'll also can make a few tweaks here to the color over life. Definitely customizing this preset quite a lot now. My idea is I want to get rid of that black smoke, and we just want it to be a kind of fire color. So I'm making a change to the color over life and just making sure we copy that across into the color over life for the auxiliary particles. And then so that makes it look less like a napalm flamethrower and just more like a standard flamethrower. I'm also going to bring the life time of those particles down as well, so they disappear sooner. So now that we've made those tweaks, we'll have another quick look at this. And it's definitely looking better, although I'm not 100% certain about those big streams at the top. So I'm going to reduce the emission point from 50 to 35. So all that means is that the particles will stop emitting after 35% of their lifetime, as opposed to the 75% we had. So this will just tone down that big mass of smoke so that we create more just like a hazy effect above where the fire is, as it was a little bit distracting before. And now I think we'll re-enable the motion blur for both of the particle comps. And all that's left now is to just render both of these out as pre-rendered assets. So we'll wait for this to preview. Looks a lot better with the motion blur. There is an additional option we have to try and fix the edges here. It's quite an expensive option. It's this refine soft matte edge, which is off by default. And that will add additional reduction techniques to the edges here to try and smooth out some of those random, but it's another layer of sampling, another layer of motion blur. It's definitely helping to clean up the edges a bit, but it's up to you whether you want to use that, because it's got chatter reduction, subframe sampling, motion blur around the edges, and it is going to increase the render time. But if you don't mind the extra render time, you can enable that option. We'll adjust this render region here while we wait for the full resolution render to finish. When you go to full res, it's also got to recache the entire sim up to that 2-second point as well, and then preview it at full res with all of the samples. We'll take a screenshot, and I'm just going to compare it to what it looks like without the refined soft matte edges. So this is what it looks like when it's on, and then this is what it looks like when it's off. So that's on and that's off. And I think in this example, I think I'm going to go with the extra render time. I'm going to keep it on to have that extra layer of smoothness, because when we go to the export comp, we also have this additional pixel motion blur, which is just 2 samples, very low detail, and all this is doing is it's just adding a little bit of extra motion blur to everything. Quite subtle, but it really helps to sell the movement. It's not quite enough to fix the edges though, so we'll keep all these expensive settings on, very high samples, and since we don't mind waiting, we'll have this fire go for even longer here. And I'll also make the same extension to the emission time here as well. That's the idea, is we just have 2 jets of fire. We'll pre-render each of these. Make sure we have the alpha channel. QuickTime animation. We'll save this as a flamethrower asset that we can use. And then we'll just render this out so we can use it. And let's see how long this took to render. Probably quite a while, I imagine. Okay, so it took 2 hours and 43 minutes each. So that was quite a time to wait. But hopefully we only have to do that one render and we can make all of our compositing tweaks here. I don't mind waiting a few hours if I'm getting a good result that I know I'm going to be happy with. And once we've rendered that, we'll just bring those in, solo it so we have it nice and quick. And we'll go to the export comp here. And we'll bring that render region down. And then we'll go into our footage and we'll bring in our background image as well. And we'll just have a quick look at what the compositing options are doing. So I'm normally quite happy with how it looks with the default settings here, but I guess we could experiment with some of these. If the fire was really close, probably want to extend the radius here. Got the fire contrast, but I don't know, I just feel like going for a more glowy look. Got the smoke contrast, I guess we'll bring that down a bit so that the smoke looks more translucent, as we were trying to hide that. Depending on how desaturated we want, we can change the gamma, we can make it even brighter if we really want those highlights to be blown out. Got this additional glare, which is quite nice. This compound blur, which can make the fire look less sharp and more integrated into the atmosphere. Got some ground lighting here. Speaking of ground lighting, I think we'll adjust that because it's in a bit of a weird position. So it just uses this corner pin here. It's quite easy to visualize where that lighting should be. And then we've also got a shadow as well. I'm not going to spend too much time adjusting this shadow because it is an overcast scene and I can't even identify any shadows in the scene. So with that in mind, we'll make the shadow very diffused itself. But there is smoke there, so it might cast some effect on the ground. Bring that opacity down. And then once we've done that, I think what we can do is we can just render this out as a pre-comp. We'll just give this a name, we'll just call it Palace Flamethrower 01. Going to render this out and use that as the background for when we bring in the second flamethrower. So now I'll go into the particles comp and we'll replace that with the other flamethrower. Obviously we'll solo the one that we want. Go back into the export comp and it will now appear on the other side. And now if we bring in our pre-rendered shot here, we'll bring that in. Now we'll have both flamethrowers, and then the trick is just to try and get them to interact with each other in a way that looks pleasing. So there is some strange lighting going on here, and I think we can solve that by just increasing the smoke contrast a bit. And I think we'll also bring down this auto exposure to about 50. And then we'll go to our hue slider, and this is the bit we've been waiting for. So we'll try 100. This isn't Harry Potter, so we'll go to 180. And there we go, that's that nice shade of blue that we were looking for. And we'll give this a really quick preview just to try and identify any issues here. So for the most part, it seems to be interacting okay, although there are a few moments where the smoke kind of occludes the glow on the fire. It kind of makes it look a bit strange, and there is an option for that. If you've noticed this Roto pre-comp here, if the fire was going behind an actor, you could bring in a matte, and then it's using the opposite of that alpha channel. That would allow the glows to wrap around an actor who was standing in the foreground. But what we want to do instead is we'll copy our Flamethrower 01, the first one that we did. We'll go into the Roto comp and we'll just paste our flamethrower in there. So now it's essentially going to use that as a matte. It's now occluding the other flamethrower. We don't actually want that, because if we go back into the export comp, that's not quite the effect we wanted. But there is this light wrap effect, which is going to add some of that glow back on top. You can see the kind of effect it's going to add. So we want that, but we don't want the fire to be occluded, so we'll just go to no track matte. And so now we're just using the fire as an input for this light wrap effect here, which in my opinion is improving it somewhat. And then I'm actually going to go through the whole thing. I'm just going to create little keyframes for the smoke. So on 1 second, I think I'm happy with how it looks. We'll go to 2 seconds. Quite glowy, so I'm going to make the blue fire a bit more pronounced there. I'll go forward to 3 seconds to our trouble frame. I think here, this is where I'll bring it down a bit more. Then we'll go forward to 4 seconds, and then I think we'll bring the smoke contrast back up again to have the blue fire be the dominant one. We can also add a warp mesh to one of the fire layers to just add a bit of additional distortion. So we'll add this to the render queue. I'll render this out and we'll have a look at how this looked. So I just added a little bit of a mesh distortion there just to help bend the fire a little bit more. And of course, you can customize every project to create unique assets and VFX shots that complement your film. We'll wrap things up there for now, but be sure to stay tuned for next time when we'll be covering some of the other elements. Good luck with your projects and thanks for watching.